All right, folks, we are up to topic 3.8, the Constitutional Convention and debates over ratification. Let's get into our big topic today. So our first guiding question is, in what ways was the Constitution a product of compromise between differing ideological positions? The key word here is compromise. We're going to talk a lot about that today. So we need to first talk a little bit about how the Constitution came to be, and that requires us to go to Philadelphia for a convention. Originally, the Constitutional Convention was called not to write a new constitution, but to revise the Articles of Confederation, to look at its weaknesses, look at its flaws, and try to fix them. And this convention opened on May 25th, 1787 in Philadelphia, and it actually in the same exact place the Declaration of Independence was signed. So, as I said, the guys who arrive, and they are all guys who arrive to this convention, they're there to save the Union. They're there to prevent anarchy. They're there to prevent something along the lines of Shays' Rebellion. But when they get there, they realize the Articles of Confederation simply can't be revised. They're not effective. And so they decide to completely scrap the Articles of Confederation. Now, by doing this, they are technically overthrowing the government of the United States because they're getting rid of the Articles of Confederation. And they don't necessarily have any actual legal authority to do that under the Articles of Confederation. Nonetheless, they're going to continue with this process. And it was top secret. I mean, they had armed guards at the doors, windows shut tightly even though it was a hot summer, because they didn't want a lot of information sneaking out while this thing was under discussion. So let's think about why there would be tension between big states and small states. And of course, it has to do with how much voice they would have, right? Small states, the argument goes, since they have fewer people, they should have less voice. Small states would counter by saying we're all states, therefore we should have the same voice. There's also the issue of what kind of government should we produce. So the original Articles of Confederation created a unicameral legislature. There was only one house. That's what unicameral means, one house. There were people who thought, well, no, we should move to a bicameral legislature. That means two houses. So we're going to first look at what's known as the Virginia Plan. You can remember this as the Large State Plan. It was a product of future President James Madison. He envisioned a bicameral Congress where there'd be two houses, and in both houses, representation would be based on population. So bigger states would have more representatives, smaller states, fewer representatives. A man named William Patterson responds with what's known as the New Jersey Plan, or the Small State Plan. He envisioned a unicameral Congress where there would be equal representation regardless of size or population. In other words, basically exactly what they had under the Articles of Confederation. Let's just kind of keep that one going. And these two plans clearly are at odds. So what's needed here is a compromise. And what comes out of this is known as the Connecticut Compromise. It's sometimes also referred to as the Great Compromise. And what it does is it produces the government we have today. And the House of Representatives, the representatives themselves will be based on population. So bigger states have more representation, smaller states have fewer. And the representatives themselves are elected by the people. In the Senate, however, there would be equal representation, 2 senators per state, regardless of population, regardless of physical size. And originally, senators were not chosen by the people, but by the state legislatures. That won't change until the 20th century. But, again, this is a bicameral legislature, 2 houses. The next big compromise we need to look at deals with the issue of slavery. So, if the House of Representatives is made up of members who represent states, and bigger states have more of those representations, thus more political power, the question was, well, do we count slaves for matters of representation? Do we count them into that number for, say, Virginia or South Carolina? Northern states said, well, no. I mean, the slaves are not citizens. The South doesn't recognize their political rights or even basic human rights, so why in the world would we count them as people towards representation and giving the South more representatives. And the South basically said, well, no, we should count them because we want to have as much influence as possible. Therefore, we should count slaves as people for the matter of representation in Congress. Well, what comes out of this, of course, is the famous, or I guess you could argue infamous, Three-Fifths Compromise. So for this compromise basically says that the South doesn't get to count every one of their slaves. Rather, for every 5 slaves, you get to count 3 of them towards representation. So basically, 3/5 of a person would be every slave, right? Only 60% basically. This has been very controversial at the time, and obviously looking back on it, it certainly is. It can be viewed as a very negative thing, and it certainly is when you think about it, only 60% counting as a person. You can also look at it slightly differently and think about it from the perspective that at least the Three-Fifths Compromise did not give the South even more political power, right? And also, what if the South had been able to count slaves as people for representation? I mean, it's even more ridiculous than doing that because they're not giving these slaves any basic human rights. So why would they get to count them just to give them more power? All right, one more issue when it comes to slavery and compromise. A further issue is, what do we do about the slave trade? I'm talking about the transatlantic slave trade. And there were differing opinions on this. Many northern states wanted to end it, many southern states did not. And so it was decided that for 20 years, the transatlantic slave trade would continue. And then in 1807, Congress then can revisit this issue, and they could end it if they saw fit to do so. And they did. So after 1807, legally speaking, no more slaves could be brought from Africa to what is the United States. Now, some did; they were smuggled in, but legally speaking, the slave trade ended. All right, so that's a good example of how the Constitution was a product of compromise, whether you're looking at the small state, big state issue, or compromises over slavery. The point is, neither side got exactly what they wanted, but they created a document that they could both live with. Now we're going to talk about the actual ratification debates. We're going to look at the causes and effects of those debates over the ratification of the Constitution. Because it is no sure thing that everybody is going to be in favor of this new Constitution. After all, any type of compromise you have is going to leave some people feeling disappointed. And so maybe if there's enough people, this thing could not even become the Constitution as we know it today. So there are 2 major sides in this debate. You've got one side we're going to refer to as the Federalists. They were in favor of ratification of the Constitution. They believe there should be a strong federal government. These people tended to be wealthier, better educated, better organized. They tend to be kind of the elite of society. They owned a lot of the newspapers, so they were very good at being able to manage the message about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution itself. And they had some big names attached to their cause. Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, James Madison, all Federalists. George Washington is kind of a Federalist as well. He's not ever officially a Federalist, but he's got Federalist tendencies, I guess we'll call them. On the other side, we have the anti-Federalist. These are opposed to ratification. They're opposed to a stronger federal government. They want the states to retain their power, just like under the Articles of Confederation. These people tend to be more rural. They tend to be poorer, less educated. They are the people who fear that if the rich and powerful have too much power, then the powerless and the poor will suffer. They also had some pretty big names attached to their cause, like Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty guy, a cousin of John Adams. There's Patrick Henry, a famous patriot. He's the guy who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And there's also Richard Henry Lee, a big name in the patriot cause. So the Anti-Federalists, what do they have as far as complaints? Well, their first complaint was that the Constitution was written kind of in secrecy. It was drawn up by aristocrats. It was not as democratic as they would have liked. They feared that state sovereignty was going to be weakened. They decried a lack of Bill of Rights. They also noticed that this new Constitution allowed for a standing army, and the Anti-Federalists were very suspicious of that. Like, why do you need an army if we're not at war? Is this army going to be used to control the people and suppress the people? They also didn't like the fact that to get this new Constitution in place, you only have to have a ratification of 3/4 of the states. So a whole quarter of the states could say, nah, we don't really want this Constitution, but they would have to go along with it anyways. And these complaints are pretty legitimate. I mean, there was no Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. It was drawn up by mainly aristocrats. It was going to weaken states significantly. So they had real, genuine complaints. The Federalists, though, as I said, they were really good at managing the message, about getting out their viewpoint in a way the Anti-Federalists simply couldn't match. And a great example of this would be the famous Federalist Papers. This will be a series of 85 articles. You can think of them as essays. They were written for New York newspapers to try to convince New Yorkers to vote in favor of ratification for this new Constitution. We're not going to get into any specifics right now, but be aware of the Federalist Papers and what they were trying to do. They're trying to get the Constitution ratified, and so they're often known by their numbers. So if you ever see something like Federalist number 37 or Federalist number 51 or something like that, that's a reference back to one of these essays that were written in favor of ratification. Very influential essays. Well, the Federalists are, of course, going to carry the day. That's why we have this Constitution today. One of the things that helps this Constitution get ratified when maybe it would not have is that the Federalists promised that once the Constitution was ratified, it would then be immediately amended to include a Bill of Rights that would list explicitly what your rights are as citizens, and would also explicitly restrict the powers of the federal government. Now, there were some people who were against having a Bill of Rights, and not because they didn't think that people should have rights. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There was one group of people who felt that a Bill of Rights was dangerous because if you write down, say, 10 rights or 15 rights or 20 rights or something like that, then the government can simply say, well, that's all you have. That's all the rights you get. And so they were worried that by writing down certain rights, other rights would be trampled upon, as opposed to just kind of having it open and then just assuming all these rights then it would be protected by the government. All right, so we've covered the ratification of the Constitution, guys. So now it is in place. It's ready to go. And in our next topic, we'll continue this look at the early days of the Republic.